A disturbing trend growing in our culture is the spread of adults choosing to cut their parents out of their life. Many mothers and fathers of these adult children are now facing an unexpected reality. Their grown children are walking away, not only from their faith, but from them. The statistics are sobering. Research from Cornell University's Family Reconciliation Project found that roughly 27% of American adults report being estranged from at least one family member. And with child alienation of parents affecting at least an estimated 1 in 10 families. In like manner that the Soviet Union took the commandment not to covet, inverted it, and weaponized it, so also is our own culture has done the same thing with the commandment to honor your father and mother, inverted it and weaponized it. We have already knew from decades of Barna research that parents were, in essence, crossing their fingers as to whether their children would still retain their faith after they grew up and left home. Now that same gamble has extended to whether that child will want them in their life at all. In large part, we can attribute this to two factors that did not exist for previous generations. One, widespread therapy culture, and two, ubiquitous social media. Both of these have become echo chambers wherein just about any perceived imperfection of the parent could be pathologized by the child seeking validation for their persistent bitterness over things that may or may not have actually been bad at all. Do not take this, be careful, do not take this as any excusing of actual abuse that might have occurred in a home where an adult genuinely mistreats a child. The scriptures and historically the church firmly would condemn that. But that's not what we're addressing here. In our society, therapy culture and toxic maternal smothering have allowed a generation of children, adult children, to recast any manner in which they experienced discomfort growing up as some crime against the child's mental health. This then was enthusiastically affirmed not only by self-serving therapy industry, but by hordes of social media users, all cheering on the complaints of saying, "That's right, your parents were a downer. Set boundaries and go, quote, no contact. Cut them out of your life for the sake of your mental health." This malaise of pronouncing judgment on the previous generation enabled very normal parenting strategies to be retold as a story of supposed neglect, because quote unquote neglect, because you were sent to bed without dinner once. Quote unquote abandonment, because you had to walk yourself home from school. Quote unquote physical abuse, because you got spanked once for mouthing off to your mother. Or quote emotional abuse, because you were told no about anything. The slightest discomfort, inconvenience, or negative emotion becomes grounds for the adult child to judge their parents from a place of superiority. And the sin of resentment festers until you follow the no contact trend that's in our society today. Heartbroken parents of grown children that have taken this path talk of the hopelessness they feel, knowing that there's nothing they can do to combat this. Attempts to solve the issue by reaching out more are interpreted by the adult child as, quote, controlling. Pulling back and waiting for the child to come to them only is interpreted again by that adult child as reinforcing their internal narrative of the parent abandoning them. The grieving parent can't win. All they can do is suffer, worry, and pray. But somewhere along the line, in their quiet moments, that same grieving parent, they come to empathize with God, who has been dealing with this problem for all of human history. Before we pass judgment on that adult child choosing to remain estranged from their parents, saying, just calling them all narcissistic brats, let us remember two things clearly. That one, we are the ones that told the Father, "I'm leaving and you'll never hear from me again." And two, that the Father is the model of the ultimate compassion, leaving open the means of our reconciliation through Jesus Christ. While historically our gospel reading today has been titled The Story of the Prodigal Son, it's actually more accurately titled The Story of the Compassionate Father, because he is the main protagonist. The wayward son is not the star of the story, the father is. It is the father who has to watch his ungrateful son walk out the door and over the horizon, basically treating the father as if he's already dead to him. It is the father that watches down the road and sees his returning son coming from a great distance, then running out to greet him, hug and kiss him, and celebrate his son's return. It also is the father who has to go out and deal with his angry older son that can't wrap his mind around this unreasonable, inexplicable compassion of the father. So the compassionate father is the star of the story, along with his heartbreak watching his one son walk away, and then the disappointment when the other son just doesn't get it. Jesus is telling a story that would have been very personal to him because the triune God is the Father. And every listener at the time would have been riveted because all of them would have felt deeply some aspect of the tale. The first century Jewish audience would have understood that asking for your inheritance now is tantamount to reducing that sacred relationship of parent and child to its monetary value. Ever experienced the death of a loved one where inheritance is involved? People can shock you when the side of them comes out. And suddenly, instead of grieving and mourning, they're all seeing dollar signs hovering over the casket. And this basically has that mentality. But he basically admits it right up front. Give me now what I would have gotten when you die, and then I'm out of here. Our current paedocentric culture cannot imagine the reality of how possible it is for children to harm their parents. By the time a child reaches puberty, it is well within their power to wound and hurt their father and mother in ways that, if God in His grace grants them understanding, they will seek forgiveness for it later. The prodigal son abandons the household of the father, monetizing that relationship, and then turning his back as though his father was already dead. In this way, he reflects this growing trend in our culture also. But before we click our tongues and pass judgment, if we all don't immediately identify with the wayward son, we will miss out on the major point of the story. Early church fathers rightly pointed out that Jesus was contrasting the celebration of bringing lost Gentiles into his plan to the entitled Jew, so that the entitled Jews thought that they had been the obedient son all along, but couldn't comprehend God's grace. That's sort of a meta application that's both true to the original intent to the parable and still very applicable as it relates to geopolitics today. But among those primary layers of the story is for the hearer to relate to the wayward prodigal son and take full ownership of that manner that we acted the same way toward our Father who is in heaven. We are the ones that said, I don't want you in my life. My peers say you're too controlling, but I'll go ahead and monetize this relationship anyway. Give me what I think I'm owed so I can turn my back on you. And we never stop to think that what we've done in the process. We never stop to think that if God's heart can rejoice over our return, it also can be broken by our estrangement. Everyone talks about the attributes of God, His grace, His justice, His wrath, but no one talks about God's pain and the possibility that we're often in the business of breaking God's heart. Don't worry, He can handle it. God has much more fortitude in that matter than the rest of us. He can handle it in ways I can't even understand and fathom. Estranged parents cycle through anger, heartbreak, and despair, often wonder if anyone can relate to their pain at all. And here comes our Father in heaven saying, I can relate. I understand. I went through the same thing when you turned your back on me. This is why we must relate to the prodigal son, though he's not the star of the story. The story of the compassionate father is so applicable that it retains its potency no matter what era of history or cultural context you tell it in. In the first century, this might be a story about God's grace extended to Gentiles while the Jews looked on cluelessly and jealous. But in later years, every reader would understand that the human heart universally falls into either of these two categories. You're either one son or the other. You read the story that you're either, in this way, you're either grateful for God's grace, unreasonably extended to you after you broke God's heart when you walked away, or two, you're convicted for your heart, you're convicted in your heart for having forgotten what God's grace is all about and needed the reminder. But modern therapy culture would read the story through an entirely different lens. In their telling of it, and if you're coming at it from a contemporary perspective, in the therapist's perspective is the controlling father who was withholding resources from the prodigal son that would only be made accessible upon his death. So the prodigal son had to assert himself and take control of his life. The fact that he fell on hard times was not his fault. That was beyond his control. So he returned to where the resources were abundant and the father could just continue to fulfill his duties to the son. See how the story can be retold with the entitlement, through an entitlement viewpoint? And think about the older son, the obedient son. Think about how it can be retold that way. Imagine him sitting on the couch of some counselor's office while the therapist says, stroking their chin. The son says, Dad always loved the other son more. Look how he threw a party when that loser came back to leech off the family again. And the therapist would lean back, steeple their fingers, and affirm their viewpoint in his analysis, saying, how can we help you cope with your father's unjust treatment for showing that preference? It would never occur to them to tell the patient, hey, dummy, sounds like a wonderful redemption story that unfolded right in front of you, and you were too bitter to enjoy it. None of us are immune to this. All of us have a little narcissist somewhere deep inside, just waiting to come out at the right moment. But our current culture really does have some unique modern factors that really do enable that vice. For that reason, we all must focus on the crux verse of the passage, that of verse 17. Now, I love how the King James puts it. There are certain modern translations that are valid, but sometimes the wording is perfect in our reading today. When it says, when he came to himself, quote the line from, prior to that, you would have that quote from that line from Braveheart which says, he wasn't right in the head. In this case, when he came to himself, that phrase points at the exact moment when the prodigal son began his journey back to the Father. It started in his mind and in his heart with the realization, I'm the sinner in the story. My main character syndrome is actually an unhappy tale of my own making. I'm the one that needs to change, not everybody else. For all of us, that was the beginning of our return to God after our heartbreaking estrangement from him. When he came to himself, quoting from the verse, is a summary statement that encapsulates all the ways your mind and your heart went from victim to victor, from lost to found. We must relate to the prodigal son not only in how he walked away, but especially in how he took ownership of his need to return. But he's not the only character we must relate to. Parents of estranged kids hope and pray that their grown children will change their minds and hearts. But as they suffer, they wonder whether anyone can relate to them at all. And God's voice, they can hear God's voice saying, I can relate to that. And the voice of the Lord is, I hear you. I go through that all the time. The story of the compassionate father remains one of the most recognized and quoted parables of Jesus, even to those unfamiliar with the rest of the Bible, because it is so relatable to everyone at any point in any context in history. It has particular applicability to our culture now and would counter much of the estrangement encouraged by our therapy culture and social media. But when we relate to the moment, when we turn to that moment, it says, when he came to himself. When we all collectively come to themselves, we drop all that pride and return to the Father, humbly asking for his unreasonable grace once again. Amen.